Hello, everyone, and welcome to York University's Disaster and Emergency Management program. My name is Dr. Ida Memuji, and I'm very excited today to introduce Cheryl Rogers. Cheryl Rogers is a longtime volunteer and, in fact, one of the founders of the Canadian Disaster Animal Response Team. And we're very excited to have her here today to share her thoughts on animal disaster management and where things are in Canada. Cheryl has been so kind as to carve out some time from her busy schedule to speak with us today, and I'm extremely excited for her presentation. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Ida. And thank you for having me on your first, I didn't realize, inaugural webinar. And I do wish I could be there in person, but at least technology allows us to still discuss the most important issues that we have within animals and in disaster management. As was stated, I am Cheryl Rogers. I am the National Coordinator for CDART, the Canadian Disaster Animal Response Team. We are the only registered charity in Canada at this time that's devoted solely to animals and disasters, as far as I know. We started in 2003 after the wildfire season in British Columbia. We started in British Columbia, but we've expanded since then. For myself, I've been doing animals and emergencies since 1999. I've been involved in disasters large and small. Starting with the big one of 2003 was the largest one. I've also went to Katrina. I also was in Fort McMurray, and then of course this past summer here in BC with the wildfires, and I also did some training in Calgary after the floods there and in High River. So we'll go on to the next slide. And basically, there's natural and man-made disasters, and there's disasters big and small. But regardless of what the disaster is, if there's humans involved, there's very likely animals involved. And what it has been in the past is there's been very few times when animals have necessarily been included with the planning. So from a social point of view, they've kind of just been, animals are possessions. It's up to the people to deal with their possessions. And the emergency management people haven't really concerned themselves with animals as a specific piece of an emergency plan. So from the point of view of CDART, we do this because we feel that animals, of course, need to be part of the plan. They've done studies. There was a 2010 study in New Zealand that showed that over half of the people that were involved with the study said pets were essential to their well-being. So obviously, in a disaster situation, we want to make sure that people's pets are with them. And then after Katrina, there was a lot of studies done, and time after time, it showed that people were more adversely affected by the loss of their pets than they were by the loss of their homes. So pets are a big piece of disaster management, or should be, we feel, and that's why we came into existence. And if you look at the slides here, there's the one that shows some writing on, it's actually some writing on a school door, and that's from Katrina. And people had to evacuate St. Bernard's Parish, and they took their animals to a school because that was the highest ground, and they left them there because they didn't know what else to do. And later, the St. Bernard Parish police went in and killed them all, and not humanely. And it was quite a big issue with Katrina, and in the end, as far as I know, no one ever got charged. And so what we try and do with the CDART is to make sure nothing like that ever happens again, that the people are not forced in the evacuation situation to do that the law enforcement are not faced with some sort of decision to be made. And so that's why we think it's important that we work and continue. So next slide. So today, what I'm going to go through is just a brief history of CDART, and then look at animals and disaster management from a 4 pillars approach. Then at the very end, we'll just briefly touch on CDART's future plans in case anybody wants to join with us and go forward. And then just at the very end, we thought it would be a good idea to put some criteria for animal responders, so that if you were in a position of being in an emergency program coordinator or some other emergency management position, you'd have an idea of sort of who you're looking at to fulfill this important function. So can go to the next slide. Essentially, what happened was in the beginning, there was animals considered, but it was always basically an international relief, and it was farm animals, it was agriculture, because in the developing world, without their animals, their community will end. The animals are integral to their community, integral to their socioeconomic status, everything. So that's sort of how animals and disaster management started, and that was with international groups like IFA, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and World Animal Protection Society, which has renamed itself. Within North America, it didn't really start until the 80s when a woman called Terry Crisp started a group called UANERS, United Animal Nation Emergency Animal Rescue Service. They've since changed their name to Red Rover, and they're still around. And that was in the 80s.
And she helped develop the FEMA modules that deal directly with animals. And she continued on, and she started her own group, Noah's Wish, which is now defunct. Initially, the initial people that started CDART, we were initially Noah's Wish because, as I said before, there was nothing in Canada. And we responded in 2003 as Noah's Wish volunteers. As a result of that response, we decided that we really needed a Canadian group, a Canadian component, because as much as we are similar to our American neighbors, we're not the same. The way we respond to disasters is not the same. So after the firestorm in 2003, some of the volunteers then got together and we started CDART. And it's 100% volunteer. So most of us do it. Most of us are doing other things like jobs and families and things. So it's been a slow go at growing it. We get, I guess, big impetus whenever there's a large disaster, or if we attend a conference or something where people find out about us, but it's been a slow go. But we do, as of 2018, have trained volunteers in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. Now, admittedly, some of those are because people have moved from British Columbia, because that's where we did start. But the idea is that we will eventually be truly a national body, and we will have trained volunteers throughout the country. The importance of having trained volunteers can't be stressed enough, because when you're working with other emergency management people or first responders that are trained, they need to know that you are trained and that you will follow within the incident command system. The other thing that's important to note is we don't have any federal legislation or provincial legislation or local legislation that deals directly with animals in emergencies. So again, as I said at the beginning, animals are property, so they fall within that. There are in the provinces some plans and legislations around agricultural animals, and that would be the large agricultural businesses, but there's nothing for the smaller farms and the hobby farms, those type of people. Okay, so I think the next slide. So the next slide just shows, I've lost my slides here, what we do. Am I on the right slide?
Noah's Wish, I see Noah's Wish.
It's the pictures.
Yeah, but now
next slide is the pictures. So those are just a few of the groups that that we have had throughout the years. In the States, they have an organization called NARS, the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition, and that started after Katrina, and that provides member agencies a unified command and a unified response. We don't have anything similar in Canada, and whether we would ever do that, it's hard to say, because we don't set things up the same way. So now we'd be on the next slide, what we do. So with CDART and with any animal response team, once it was developed, it would deploy upon the request of the government. So it would be either local, provincial, federal, depending on the extent of the disaster and who was doing the deployments. We would never self-deploy, because as professional responders, we would never self-deploy. What we do is we provide rescue, sheltering, fostering, and other care of domesticated animals. CDART's mandate is not specifically pets or anything else. It's any animals that are dependent on human beings. So that could be many different types of animals, not just pets and livestock, and we'll get to that in a bit. What we also do is we train volunteers so that in the event of a disaster, people have the training and they are able to respond appropriately within the rules in the incident command system. We educate the public So we'll go to community events, we'll talk to people, we'll do presentations at the Lions Clubs or other charities, churches, that type of thing, so that the public are prepared to care for their own animals. Because ultimately, it's better if everybody can take care of themselves. That's what we're trying to, train people to do, be prepared, be self-sufficient, 72 hours, all of those programs. And we just want to make sure that people are also including their animals within that and recognizing the different requirements for their animals. And we also advise emergency management officials on how to include animals. So we were involved with there was a consultation process here in British Columbia about earthquakes with Henry Rancheria, and we were involved with that. And when the government is developing information on disasters and animals, we are often consulted on that. So just so that because we have the experience in the background, and we'll do that for the governments. So next slide. So now we come to our first pillar, which is mitigation. So in terms of the animal aspect of things, quite often animals are kept in more vulnerable areas. So farms are quite often on low fertile fields, which are actually floodplains. So they're prone to floods. A lot of times ranches, agriculture areas are maybe more out in the rural areas where they're more prone to interface fires and that type of thing. They're also farther away, perhaps, from first responder infrastructure, so that it takes longer for anybody to get out there to help them. So for the mitigation piece, you want to try to identify the areas of risk, like where potentially might you have a situation where animals do need assistance in the event of a disaster, what type of disasters they are, that type of thing. The HRVA study, so the vulnerable risk assessments, you do the same thing for animals as you can do for humans. The other thing you need to do is define your stakeholders. So who are you talking to? Who is going to care about the animals? Who's going to need assistance with animals? So again, as I said earlier, there's a number of different types of domesticated animals, and people normally, they'll think pets and livestock, but there also may be zoos, there may be conservation facilities, there may be labs where they're testing either human products on animals or testing for animals. All these different types of animals essentially are dependent on us. So if there is a disaster, what do we do about them? What is the plan? Depending on the situation, the plan may be that the animals have to be euthanized, but that plan has to be looked at. We did in the past work with Conservation Society out here, and what we had to do was prioritize the animals that they were trying to conserve in the event of a large-scale disaster, i.e. the earthquake that we're all hoping never comes. Which animals would they try and keep alive, and which animals would they humanely euthanize? Because at a certain point, no matter how many generators you have, how much gas you have, et cetera, you may run out of the protection that you have for the animals. So they would have to make hard choices. And many people have multiple animals in their homes. They may have to make hard choices as well. So when we're doing the mitigation piece and the preparedness piece, we want people to look at it and prioritize, so that when the time comes, you're not frozen in indecision because you've never given it any thought. So that's a piece of that. Then you also have to want to locate your resources. So within your community, if there's a disaster on the west side, what's available on the east side? If it's on the north side, what's on the south side? So it's not enough just to, of course, identify resources in a specific place, because that may be the place that's affected. So those resources are no longer available to you. And what many communities think is, well, we'll just go to the local Humane Society or SPCA or local shelters and they can do it. But they're usually full, and quite often they could be adversely affected as well. So that's another big piece. And then we suggest to look at land use. I mean, obviously animals are going to be in places where people don't want to be, or where it's better for them to be. But when we're looking at that, can we make a better choice? Can we build up the land more before we place the animals into the pasture? Those type of things. And then looking at possible infrastructure improvements. So the building codes for human buildings are not necessarily the building codes for animal buildings. So in the event of a earthquake, are the animal buildings going to fall down? Are they more likely to fall down? That type of thing. And look at the building codes for that. It offers, the mitigation stage offers the first piece, the first step on getting the animals involved into the emergency planning session and getting people to realize the scope of it. Once you go out there and you start going, okay, here's all the animal businesses, here's all the animals, then you can say, oh, this is a big piece. We need to address this as part of our response. Well, I think then next slide. So the next slide shows just some different types of disasters, and of course the boy at the top is carrying his cats out. He's evacuating from Katrina and bringing his cats out. So he probably didn't have a plan because he's got them in a sort of Tupperware container, but he did adjust to the situation. So basically, when we're looking at the mitigations, we want to look at an all hazard. We want to take an all hazard approach, and we want to look at natural and man-made disasters. And it could be something as simple, quote unquote, as a meth lab in the house next door, which involves a city block or more being evacuated. And what we want to do is make sure that when we're doing those kind of evacuations, that animals are included. Because if it's not safe for people, it's not safe for animals. And as we've shown, people's animals are more important to them in large part than their homes. So we can't ask them to leave them behind when we're leaving them in harm's way. And then the next slide is just some ideas of some different kinds of animals that you might be looking at. And as I said, most emergency plans will include the large agribusinesses. Many local emergency plans will take into account people's pets. It's the outliers, the wildlife rehabbers, the zoos, the conservation places that maybe haven't been considered. They should have plans as part of their business continuity, but it needs to be looked into. And then also the real thing that's missed is the hobby farmers. And there's a lot of people now, even in urban areas, that they're allowed to have chickens and things like that. So what do we do for those animals? What do we do for those animal owners? So on to the next. And it's preparedness, which is the big piece, hopefully. So obviously we start with the planning, and the planning is to involve the stakeholders in it. So if someone has animals and they're concerned, if we can involve them in the beginning in the planning, they're much more likely to buy into the plan in the end and be an integral part of it. Also, the stakeholders, they provide the resources. If someone's running an animal shelter, they've got a lot of the information and equipment that we may need to have an actual shelter situation. They also can provide responders. They can provide people that know the animals, that know how to handle animals. But as part of the preparedness piece, of course, you're wanting to get your memorandums of understanding, your mutual aid agreements, those type of things, because you don't want to be doing it on the fly. You want to be talking about it ahead of time. And so we found that if we can do that ahead of time, then people it's easier. You just phone, you know exactly who to phone. As an example, in the wildfires last summer, because of the extent and the size and the length and the duration and the fact that there kept being a new one every other week, it seemed like people were lacking resources. So we were really scrambling for, where can we get some more trained animal responders, or at least people with animal handling experience, because when you're dealing with animals in a disaster, they're stressed out just like the people are, and maybe not in the best of behaviors. And then the other thing that's really important for us, part of the preparedness piece, is to try and find places where you can set up temporary shelters. Because the shelters themselves, the regular shelters, as I said before, are full, and quite often they'll be in the line of the emergency anyways. And many places don't want animals in them. So in terms of community halls, churches, those type of things where you may have temporary lodging for people. And then in terms of fostering animals, especially when it comes to the agriculture animals, there's always more fear of cross-contamination. Yeah. So if an animal comes in that's diseased, then it could maybe, put the disease over to the other animals. So what we like to do is say, well, you've got a horse farm, so can we bring some sheep there? So the chance of the zoonosis is less. The main animal that we've discovered that's the hardest one to find sheltering for is pigs, because pigs have a unique set of circumstances, and the pig farmers don't want strange pigs on their farms, and the other farms aren't set up to make sure that the pigs stay actually secure. So pigs have been a big problem for us in the past. Part of the stakeholders, of course, then the people that we're going to be contacting is veterinarians. So because you never know when you may need a medical assistance, and that medical assistance will hopefully be free because there's no funding usually for animals, or at the very least on a reduced rate because of the emergency situation. And quite often the veterinarians want to be involved, but they don't know how to be involved. So that's a big piece of the planning piece. Okay, next slide. Let's see what it says. Which is continuing with the preparedness piece. So what we've got here on these slides is just some of the situations that we've encountered with the resources that we've had. So you'll see a lot of times food is the least of our worries until the time of the disaster. Like you want to source out people who may, stores and retailers and wholesalers who may provide you the food, but you don't want to store the food obviously beforehand. But the public and members of the public and stores and whatnot, during the disaster, they're very good at donating food. So that's usually the least of our worries. Sometimes it's a worry from the point of view we have too much, and then we have to do management over supplies that we don't necessarily need. What we want in terms of sheltering is hopefully something indoors. However, with animals, as I said, it can be difficult. One of the ideal places is rodeo grounds, exhibition grounds, those type of things where they're not necessarily using them all the time, and we can go in and we can set up cages and whatnot for the smaller animals. We can put the larger animals in the stalls. They work out really well. The bottom piece that looks like those cages, those are actually hog pens. Okay. But they actually work just as well for dogs. And, so thinking outside the box. And then the other thing that we often need is trailers, and people who can drive trailers, who have trailers, who know how to haul. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, at the number of people who have animals but don't have any way to move them. And maybe they've never been in a trailer since the first time they came there. So part of the preparedness piece that we do with agricultural people is, have your animals been loaded? Do you practice that? Do you have a trailer? Or they'll have a 3-horse trailer, but they have 5 horses. Or they'll have a stock trailer, but they have 3 horses, 4 pigs, 2 goats, and a cow. So when we're resourcing supplies, sometimes one of the best things we can get is someone who's willing to come in with their truck and trailer and haul other people's animals out. And again, you've got that whole, what species of animal is it? I don't want that in my trailer. All these kind of things, because again, I go back to pigs, and I love pigs. They're great. Pigs are neither prey nor predator in the minds of other agricultural animals. Like some animals such as sheep and horses and stuff are actually quite afraid of pigs. So if you have a pig smell in your trailer and now you're trying to load a horse, the horse may not go in the trailer because it smells a pig. And the more you can get your public aware of this and practicing, the better it is, because I've said to a number of people, well, the time to train your horse to get in the trailer is not when the fire's coming down the hill or the water's coming up, because you're stressed, the horse is stressed, and to go into a trailer for all these agricultural animals is totally against their instinct, because they're going in a place that has no escape. Yeah. And so they really need to work that. And if they don't have enough trailer room on their own, do they have friends? Yes. Okay, but do the friends live right beside you? Yes. Well, guess what? Your friend's trailer is going to be used for their animals, not your animals. So, we've got to work with people around that. That's a really big piece of it. And the other piece is, as I said, trying to find an indoor area. And quite often, emergency management people will say, well, animals can stay outside. And you can either believe that or not believe that, depending on what your belief system is. But the way we then approach it is say, well, yes, but we need 24/7 volunteers on site to keep an eye on these animals. We can't ever leave them just alone. They're not, we don't do that. So you have to think about the humans that are going to be with the animals. So sometimes that's a way of getting around it and getting us some sort of shelter that we can be a little bit sheltered from the elements. I mean, in a pinch, tarps, tents, that kind of thing will do. but it's better if we can get an actual structure wherever possible. So go on to the next one. So just talking here about training in general. So earlier in the lecture, I said something about we need to make sure that we've got trained responders so that the other responders will know that we'll follow the incident command system, that type of thing. A lot of the pushback on animal disasters responders have been that people are concerned that they will put themselves in harm's way in order to rescue animals. Okay. And then once they've done that, then that causes problems for other people up the line. Do we have to send a firefighter out to go find the animal person that's gone, won't come back out because they haven't got all the animals yet? Mm-hmm. So it's very important that animal responders and get trained in the incident command system, that they understand search and rescue protocols, that they have emergency first aid. Now we say for humans and for animals because that, obviously we're out for animals. And then hazardous materials, knowing about hazmat situations and how to identify that there's a potential hazard. And then also what you do, which basically is run away. You don't go near the hazard. That's our motto. And then one of the things that we quite often will end up in is a confined space because animals will hide. And what does that look like? And what is that for safety procedures? Because under the ICS that we follow and under the ICS that responders follow in emergencies and disasters is the first safety rule is safety of the responder. Yeah. So everybody has to understand that. And part of what we do as CDART is we emphasize that over and over and over again in all our training. In everything. We do mock disasters, and actually I'll go on to the next slide first. We'll go on to the next slide first. Okay. So here's the animal specific training. So CDART does an introduction to emergency pet services course. At the end of that, you'll have the basics so that if a disaster happened the next day, you would have some basic knowledge and some forms that you could photocopy and you could respond. But that's just the first step. There's a lot of other animal-specific training that's available. We have animal sheltering workshops. We have companion animal first aid. Technical large animal rescue, that's like what you see when they're getting horses out of holes and that type of thing. So that's specialized training that CDART itself doesn't provide, but we know where to access it. A lot of what we'll do for our volunteers in our local areas is we'll put on small workshops. So we'll do maybe dog behavior signals or barn safety. Mm-hmm. A lot of times people come, you're not going to know everything about every animal, nor should you be expected to. However, we are non-species specific. So you never know what you might encounter when you're out there. Mm-hmm. So even a basic, you don't have to be comfortable, but a basic knowledge is good. And wherever possible, we will not send our volunteers, our responders, into a situation with an animal they're not comfortable with. But as I said, you don't know what's going to show up. For instance, in Fort McMurray, we were contracted to do the mortality piece. And so we were expecting to recover animals and deal with grieving owners and that type of thing. That was what we were contracted for. But when we started going out to the houses, we were finding a lot of animals alive because they were reptiles. And so there were snakes and turtles and lizards and fish, and they were still alive. So, but some people aren't comfortable around snakes and things. And so, we'll try and do the best we can, but we don't know that if you enter a home, you might not find something that you weren't expecting. And that's fine. We have people that are phobic of snakes or this or that or the other thing. And then you just go, okay, you know what, I have to leave now. Because that's your comfort zone, and that's okay. But we do try and get as much familiarity with different species in terms of, identifying them, what they need to be, if we need to shelter them, that type of thing. None of us are experts. And then what we do have is a list of quote unquote experts, subject matter experts that we can contact and say, okay, what do I feed this gecko? I've got a gecko. I know I have to keep him warm. Do I feed him mealworms? I probably should know this because geckos are quite popular, but anyways, so we do a lot of that. There's also the water rescue. So there's different, whether it's like swift water or surface water, and then as I said, the animal emergency first aid. So when we send out a team, we try and have as much diversity of skills and experiences on that team, and we're pretty much always going to have someone that's got animal first aid. But it's first aid. It's okay, put the pressure bandage on, wrap them up, and get them to a vet. We're not veterinarians, and even if we have veterinarians on our team, they're still only doing emergency first aid at the time, and we're still going to, wherever possible, get them into a clinic, get them into a proper situation, get them proper medical help. So what we do when we're doing our training is we do mock disasters, and I'm just trying to see where I've lost my slides here. Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll go on to the next slide, which again is some pictures, and of some various things. Now you'll notice the horse wearing the bra, and it's a 32B, and basically bras are actually a really good tool to use to cover a horse's eyes. And many animals, if they're frightened, if they can't see, they're less likely to fight you. They're still frightened, but they can't see, so they're more docile, and they'll follow you out of a barn, or it's easier to put them into a crate, or that type of thing. So we always include the lovely Toby with his bra, and it may be a hazmat situation or whatever. There's some llamas there, so just an idea of the different kind of animals that we encounter, and the different things that we sort of quote unquote know on how to deal with them. Interesting thing to note is sheep actually have a lead sheep. Okay. So if you can figure out which is the head sheep and get the head sheep going where you want, all the other sheep will come behind, and they will come behind quickly, so get out of the way. The problem, of course, is identifying the head sheep, because it doesn't really have a hat on or any way of, you got to sort of, can't always take the time to watch the herd interact with each other to try and figure out which one you want to get going, but they do. If the head goes, the rest of them go very quickly usually. So get out of the way. Interesting. Little tip there. So we'll go on to the next one where we're talking about exercises. So one of the trainings that we have is the temporary animal sheltering workshop. And what it does is it's a hands-on. We rarely use live animals, okay, because they don't understand it's an exercise. So they don't understand why they're being put in crates, or why they're being driven here, or why this or that. So we usually use stuffed animals or photos or just scenarios written on a paper that we visualize. However, there may be people that are involved with your teams that have animals that are very social and essentially what we call bomb-proof, and they couldn't care less if they came in. We have done that with exercises. We use therapy dogs. Sometimes if someone wants to loan their assistance dogs that are used to being in sort of more stressful situations, not just chasing the ball at the park, just to get the idea of the live ones. But we do try and make them as realistic as possible. So we will actually, say that there's a gas leak. So you're on there's a gas leak, you have to leave. But no, you don't, you have to leave. It's all part of that reinforcement training for safety. So we'll do the evacuation in the temporary shelter. We'll do the sheltering in place. So it may be that this happened this past summer. We set up twice. We had to move our shelters, different shelters from different fires, but twice we had to move the shelters. One, we had the shelter set up in the city, and then the city was evacuated. So we had to obviously evacuate the shelter. The next time we had the shelter set up, and in the middle of the night, all of a sudden somebody started smelling smoke, and we were having electrical short. So again, boom, shut down the electricity, get all the animals out. Okay, now we've got a bunch of animals. It's the middle of the night. Where do we go? What do we do? So it's always nice to have multiple places for going. But this is part of when we do the exercises, this is part of trying to get people to think outside the box. And even if it's a tabletop, if you don't have the resources to set up even a tabletop, it's the working through it. It's the thinking about it, the preparedness piece. And part of what we really emphasize in terms of preparedness is getting paperwork ahead of time set up. So as I said before, we have forms, and we have no problem sharing our forms, even if you don't have our training, although we prefer you have our training or some training before you do the forms so that they're filled in correctly. But we need forms for pretty much everything, because we must document everything we do with these animals. They're not our animals. They can't speak either official language or any other human language. Maybe a parrot can every once in a while. But we need to be able to say what we did, what we saw. We have daily care. So each day we say what goes in, what comes out, what it looks like, all that fun stuff that we do. We take pictures of the animals. We have stray animals come in, so we keep them separate. We have to control people's access to our information as well. So documentation is a big piece. And one of the things that when you're looking at the mitigation and preparedness is quite often people say, well, I can't help because I can't go out and I can't rescue. Yeah. I'm 75, or I'm in a wheelchair, or I'm, whatever. Well, a lot of what we do, the bulk of what we do really is paperwork and feeding and cleaning. That's the bulk of what we do. So a lot of times people say, well, I can't rescue, but really the rescue is relatively small part of what we do. And so that, and the other thing is too, is because of the feeding and cleaning and paperwork piece, we can actually have people that are younger even, that of course we would never take them out into the evacuated area, but they can still help at the shelter. So young and old, there's really very few barriers depending on what the government regulations are. But in terms of actual response, if someone's responsible enough and can write down on the paperwork that they walked the dog and the dog did number 1 and number 2, and then they can volunteer. And what we do need is people responding who recognize the importance of the paperwork and value it and get it done, because often animal lovers, animal people, aren't big paperwork people. Okay. So they'll be like, jumping and getting the animals and, putting them in crates and putting them in their vehicle and rushing and rescuing them. And then when you get back, you say, well, where did these come from? And they go, oh, I forgot that part. Oh, no. So even on our teams that go out, we have to make sure that we have people that are detail oriented, that follow the procedures, because it doesn't do any good if we get a bunch of animals in and we don't know where they belong and who they belong to. We've been through that. We went through that with Katrina. We went through that with Fort McMurray. It's very hard sometimes to get animals back to their owners, because if you can think if it's a black lab, how do you prove it's my black lab? Especially because so many people don't have tattoos or microchips, any form of permanent identification. So it can be very difficult. So document is our mantra that we use. And as I said, if anybody wants to set up a team and needs any or wants to see our forms, they just have to contact us, and we have no problem sharing them, because it's all just good information for people to do. So we'll go on to the next preparedness slide. So a big part of preparedness, of course, is public education. Usually there's no money for advertising for animal things or even emergency things. There's very little funding for that type of information. So what we rely on is community events. So it can be a community event that's animal oriented. We go to a lot of those, but it can also just be a community event that has nothing to do with animals, because as I said at the beginning, almost everybody, either if they don't have an animal themselves, they know somebody who does. So it's a matter of getting the message out that you need to make a plan for your animals, that you need to prepare for your animals. And if you don't have your animals, this is what you do. And if you do have your animals, this is what you do. Those type of things. How do we get that word out? Or even just getting out the word, here's where you can go for this information. So any community event that we can go to, we go to quite a few, and we just, and sometimes we have to chase people and say, hey, you need to know about this. But we bring candy, and that brings kids over. And we often bring our stuffed animals as well that we use in our workshops and in our exercises, and that brings kids over. And sometimes it even brings dogs over if we're at an event where there's dogs at, and they see a stuffed dog and they're like, hey, what's going on with that dog? And they come over. So that's always good. The other way that we find is really good to get the words out is piggybacking on the back of disasters, which is because then people are sensitized. Oh my God, look what's happening. Oh my God, look at those people. They're they're riding their horses away from the flood, or, whatever. Oh, what am I going to do about my horses? So we get a lot of inquiries, and we get to disseminate a lot of information around when there's other disasters going on, especially if they're close to home. The closer they are to home, the more the people want to inquire. And so if something happens in Canada, or pretty much in the States too, Canadians are quite sensitized to that. If it's a little farther afield, it doesn't necessarily result in that sort of wave of interest and connectivity that we get on our website, but it still does increase people's interest, no matter where it is. And when we do educate, we explain about evacuations and also sheltering in place. So everybody knows about the 72 hours, that the preparedness piece that the government always says. And what we'll talk to people and say, that's the piece. They say 72 hours, but we suggest if you're going to prepare to shelter in place, prepare for at least a week.
Okay.
Go longer if you like. Because the 72 hours is really for the government to sort of get it in the event of a large scale disaster. That's the amount of time it's going to take the government to sort of get it together and make a plan and start responding to their population. And guess what? If you're not number one, you may not get responded to within 72 hours. Yeah. So you don't want to just have 72 hours and then go, oh, well, where is everybody? I've eaten all my food and drank all my water. So we talk about that, and we talk about food and water for yourself, food and water for your animals, medical supplies, sheltering supplies. If you can't stay in your house, what does that look like? And how do you keep your pets safe if you don't have access to your home? Because a lot of times people say, well, they'll just stay with me. Yeah. Well, they won't necessarily in an emergency situation because you're stressed and they're stressed. And animals, sometimes if it's stressful where they try and go away and find some place where it's not stressful. So they'll leave you. You wouldn't think they would, but they may. And then evacuation piece, we explain to people about the different levels of evacuations. So you may get an evacuation alert, which means you need to be ready to get out in a moment's notice. So that's the time to, bring your dog in from the yard, get your cat confined to the one room, move your bird from the big giant cage that it normally lives in, or maybe it doesn't even live in a cage, and put it in its small transfer cage, all of these things so that you're prepped, so that when the evacuation order comes, you're ready and your animals are ready. Because what will happen is the first responders will come and say, you have to get out. And, well, I've got to do this, and no, you don't have time for that. You don't have time. You don't have time to find where your cat went. Your cat has now found a new spot. You'll never find it, type of thing. So the best you can do is bring out as many animals as you can, but if you get an evacuation alert, secure all your animals at that time. Put horses in stalls. Bring out as many animals in and secure them as possible. If they need to leave without their animals, or if they're not even home and the evacuation alert or evacuation order comes down, and that happened to a number of people in Fort McMurray, then they need to know that hopefully there'll be somebody at the reception center, at the evacuation center, that will help them, that they can come to and say, I couldn't go home and my dog and cat are there. I couldn't go home and I had to leave, my snake and my bird, or my horse and my goat, whatever it is, so that piece. So we won't be as responders necessarily able to go right away and go get them, but they can, request the rescue. We can say, okay, we've got you. As soon as we get permission, we're going to go and we're going to do our best to get your animals out. Just to calm the people down, right? But to allow them to know that there is that peace, but it's far, far better if everybody can bring their own animals out with them. And what we also tell people is there's really a lack of support for animal response in terms of recognition for the need and also funding. And as the members of the public, if they feel that's a bad thing and they want to talk to their government officials about that, they could. So okay. It's another way of getting, trying to get some government recognition for the need for us to have a plan and to respond on behalf of animals and to include them in our disasters. Because obviously, if members of the public are upset and say, hey, what about my animals? And I will tell people, well, where do you live? What you want to do is you want to go to your local government and say, do you have a plan for animals? And if they say yes, you want to say, what is it? Because it may not be a good plan. In the States, they passed the PETS Act, Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act in 2006. That came out of Katrina, and they linked federal funding to having an animal plan included with the rest of your disaster plan. But it didn't really specify what the plan had to be. So some of the plans are not that great. One of them, I don't know if it's changed in the meantime, but I know shortly thereafter in Texas, the plan was, yes, you can bring us your animals. We will take care of them for 72 hours. then you have to come get them. And if you don't, we'll euthanize them.
Oh, wow.
Now, point of view of an animal responder, that's not a good plan, because what if you can't get them within 72 hours?
Yeah.
So
in the Canadian context, do you think there's a lot of there is support from government, or is there a lot of pushback? Is it something that's not a priority? What's your opinion on the Canadian context?
I think in a lot of places with the Canadian context, it depends where you are.
Okay.
I mean, as a rule, the federal government doesn't get involved in the nuts and bolts of all of it. It's more the provincial governments and then the local governments. Some of the provincial governments, I think, have more of a recognition than others because they've been forced into it, like the government in Alberta with the floods, and then followed by the Fort Mac fire, and also the British Columbia government with the same thing, with fires and floods in Manitoba. But there's still that lack of awareness. Most people think that, yeah, animals are just taken care of, and until they find out they're not. Most people just think they are, because, oh yeah, that's a member of my family and I'm going to evacuate with them, and I'm going to, it's all part and piece of the thing. So I think we're getting there. I think it's a process, but we're not, yeah. And I don't know that necessarily legislation is the answer. Education may be the answer, because, as I said, they did it in the States and they made this law, but it doesn't necessarily provide for a good plan in protecting animals in the event of a disaster. So I'm always a little ambivalent about that. So we'll just go on to the next slide, where it just shows a little bit of community event kind of things where we might, go out, and we've been in parades and we talk to different people and just show them the different types of animals that we deal with and the different types of scenarios they might have to deal with as part of that preparedness piece. So that's the first two pillars. So now we'll go on to the next, which is response, or as everybody likes to say, it's the sexy one, because that's where all the action is. And so in terms of the animal response, it's important that it gets integrated into the overall response. And quite often what happens is animals are an afterthought, or they're going in and they're evacuating people out, but they haven't incorporated any animal responders at the same time. So they go in and they want people to get out, but those people don't have crates for their animals, or they don't have enough trailers for their animals, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the planning piece. But then once the response happens, we're not part of it. We have to make sure that people don't self-deploy on behalf of animals, because that just causes chaos. It just causes problems for the first responders. It's not acceptable. Nobody knows who's in, who's out, what animals are going where. There's been times when multiple people have gone to save the same animal. Oh, wow. It only has to be rescued once. So it needs to be an organized, coordinated, cohesive response as part of the overall response, so that it does get done properly. Katrina, there was some parishes that got seen by pretty much everybody that was down there. And like I said, you can only rescue the animal once. There was other parishes that languished and never got anybody there for days and days and days, because there was no overarching control, there was no incident command, there was no unified command, and you don't need that. The other thing that you need is, what are you going to do with the convergent volunteers, the walk-in volunteers, that people go, I want to help. You can't just say, no, go home, because for many reasons, not in the least is that that's going to leave a bad taste in their mouth. But if people want to help, you've got to provide them a way to help. And you've got to figure out where in your response they're going to be able to fit in. Because obviously, depending on their skill set, they may or may not be able to do certain types of functions that we may be doing. For instance, in British Columbia, to do our search and response, to go into the evacuated area, you need to have a criminal record check. That's a requirement from the RCMP. So if you're a convergent volunteer, if you're a walk-in volunteer, we don't know who you are. So you will not maybe be able to do that, or maybe you can do that, but you have to go in with one of the trained volunteers, because maybe you have a special skill, like a hauler. Haulers quite often, anybody comes in with a truck and a trailer, and we're like, oh yay, and they get put to the front of the line, just because it's a specialized skill that quite often we're short of in a disaster. So it's very useful for us to have it. So you can't dismiss them, but you have to have a plan to manage them. during the response. And you also need to be, during the response, manage information and donations. And as I said earlier, quite often we'll end up getting too much food, you know, because, oh, the poor starving animals, and we get all sorts of food. We don't like to turn away donations. We like to stop the donations before they come in. This is really old story, but during the attacks in New York City on the towers, somebody decided that the dogs needed booties because they heard on the news that the dogs' pads were being damaged from going all over the rubble when they were looking for when they're doing their rescue and their missions. And so it went out on the internet, and they got literally tens of thousands of little dog booties, which they couldn't use because if they put the dog booties on, the dogs couldn't actually walk on the rubble because they would slip. Oh. So not only did they not need that many, even if they needed them, they didn't need them at all. So that comes back to the managing information piece. So you have to watch what's going out, because people may be in the best of intentions wanting to help you, but you end up getting something that you really don't need. And CDART tries to monitor as much as possible Facebook and Twitter and stuff, and try and stop well-intentioned people from sending too much stuff. We may have enough food. Stop sending us food. We don't need any more food, because what that means is when the food comes, we have to offload the food. We have to store the food. If we have food at the end of the disaster left over, what do you do with the food? You got to give it to a rescue, and then they have to come and get it, or do we deliver it? Food becomes a big problem. Information can become a big problem, because if incorrect information gets out, it can cause a situation where, you have to try and mitigate the effects of that. So there was a wildfire in British Columbia where it came out that nobody's helping the animals. We're going to all get in our trucks and we're going to go on a Facebook page. People were just, and it's like, no, this is what's happening. This is the procedures that is placed. This is what's happening right now. If you do what you're going to do, you're not helping anybody. Yeah. You're just pulling firefighters off the line because they have to go chase you down and get you out because you're putting yourself into harm's way. Don't do this. If you want to help, this is how you do it. This is what we're doing. So that kind of managing of information is very important in the response piece. And social media can be a boon or a bane, or both. It's very good at mobilizing people, and it's very good at getting the word out if you do need something, but it can also really snowball really quickly because it's exponential how people get connected. In the old days, because as I said, I started this in 99, we didn't have that problem. Yeah. Everybody had to phone somebody. So if we needed something, or even if we didn't need something, that piece of everybody telling their friend, it didn't magnify so quickly. So it was a lot easier to control information, control donations management, control volunteers, that type of thing. It was all fewer and less, so it was easier to control. So that's a new thing that we have to do during response. And if you have someone available, ideally you want somebody monitoring all that stuff 24/7, because you have to nip it in the bud, because once it gets out there, it's gone. So on to the next slide. Get your response levels. You're going to have your immediate response, which will be 24 to 72 hours, which is that immediate surge when everybody's evacuating, when you're still trying to get your volunteers deployed, your resources in place, all of that. Our suggestion is to go big for the initial surge, because you can always back down. If you underestimate your initial surge, then you end up having lineups of people or backups, and that's not good in that situation because people are already stressed out. During the initial 24 to 72 hours, we would be looking at potentially sheltering. So we may set up a temporary animal shelter. We would be looking at potentially going, if we had permission from the authorities, to go in and get animals out that could not be initially evacuated. We may also be looking at going in and maintaining animals. So it may be that an animal, for whatever reason, the owner doesn't want their animals to come out. It may be a flock of chickens that they go, you know what? As long as the fire's not there, as long as they get fed and watered, I just assume leave them there. I don't want them to come out. One of the services that we do as CDART, and that you want to consider on your teams, is having someone that will go in and feed and clean and water animals for the ones that they don't want them to come out. It may be a situation for insurance purposes, or we've dealt with thoroughbred farms like racehorses where they're like, well, I don't want to take the chance of moving my horse out to some unknown place. I'd rather take the chance with them here. So what we will do is we'll go in and we will feed and clean and water and whatever. If it looks like it's not a good situation, we will inform the owner. We will say, look, it's really smoky here, or, oh, you know what, it looks like the fire's a lot closer, the water's a lot closer. Do you want us to take them out? But if they keep saying no, then the answer is no. Because ultimately, under our laws, those animals belong to those people, and it's not up to us to evacuate them if we've been told not to. So that's another part of the training, another piece of the training that people have to understand and accept, that piece. And as I said before, documentation, part of the immediate response. And in that initial surge, it's really hard sometimes to get that documentation done because you're like, well, I don't have time. I'll do it later. And I know because I've succumbed to that a couple of times myself, but then you don't have time later either. So it's really important to just bear down and get that paperwork done as you go. Even when you've got people lined up outside the door and dogs are barking and cats are scratching people, you've got to get that piece done. And then the other big piece for the immediate is, can you get the volunteers? Who can you get in? Because in the short term, people have to rearrange their lives. So what we've found is that you basically need probably 4 to 6 times as many people as you actually need on your list to get the number of people that you need, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if you need 10 people on the ground, you need a list of 40 to 60 people to call on to try and get those 10 people. So part of our push for CDART and for any emergency management situation is to train as many people as possible so that you have that big well of people to call upon. Because as I tell people all the time, I said, we can't schedule disasters. They just won't allow us to. I can't tell you, no, don't go on holidays next weekend because there's going to be a big fire. Now, we do work with government and government agencies, and they may say, that, like, for instance, right now in British Columbia, the snowpack is quite high in most areas. So there's a better chance that there's going to be a bad flood season. So we can say that to our volunteers, but we cannot say with certainty that they'll even be deployed at all. So you can't ask people to put their lives on hold because it's going to be a long, hot, dry summer. So everybody that lives in, well, pretty much every province, you can't go on holidays if you're a responder because there might be a fire. You can't do that. So as many people as we can get trained as possible is best. And we want volunteers, as I said before, that are skilled in the animal handling aspects, as many species as possible, and in the administration. And that by that I mean paperwork, dealing with people, that kind of thing. If you can get those people and you can get them there, and even sometimes if you can get people to say, look, I can come, but I can come only for 72 hours, that can be really helpful. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of those people that can pretty much rearrange on a dime. So I'm one of those people that can say, well, okay, yeah, I can get boots on the ground ASAP, but then I may have to go back because I just shoved everything to the side. Mm-hmm. I can go there. So you need all these different people. So when you're recruiting, when you're looking at your teams, when you're looking at the needs, that's one of the things. Maybe somebody can come right away, but they have to go back. Other people maybe take a week to get ready, but once they've got their ducks in a row, they can go for a month. Not that I advocate responding for a month, but just as an example. So that's the immediate response. And if you look at the next slide, it just shows some of the animals and different ways of transporting and some of the effects. Now, obviously, those animals, it wasn't immediate, the skinny ones, that wasn't in the immediate response. Well, it was in the immediate response for us because that was Katrina. And Katrina was unique in that it took so long for people to get in. So it was very difficult. And if you look at the picture of the fish, what we do with fish, depending on the situation, if someone has a very large aquarium, we may not, be able to help. But I tell people with fish, what fish is important to you? Is there one that's more expensive? Is there one that you like better? Do you want to, that you want to get out? But we move fish in Ziploc bags. So we scoop the fish with its water into a Ziploc bag, then we bring hopefully they'll have a smaller tank, or we'll access a smaller tank and we'll put them in the smaller tank if they want evacuation. But quite often, if it's a large aquarium, that type of situation, we'll do the maintenance. We'll just say, you know what, we'll do the best we can to go in and clean and feed, and hopefully the fish will make it through. And people are pretty good about that usually. The moving the fish out, quite often it'll be a kid's fish, like, you know, they've got their goldfish or they've got their tetras or whatever, and it's important to them to have their fish. So that's quite often a family pet type of situation, not a sort of visual relaxation aquarium that we're moving. But we'll move anything, big or small. We'll do them all. So, and then quite often, if people have birds or small animals, they may be in a really large cage, or they may not even be in a cage. They need to have a transport cage. You need to be able to keep them secure. You can't just go, well, yeah, but I walk around with my parrot on my shoulder all the time. Okay, maybe in normal situations you can do that. This is an emergency. You don't know when the siren might go off. You don't know. So we need everybody secured. And part of the immediate needs for the pet people is having some extra crates and leashes and whatnot, so that if people do come in with their animals and they're not secure, we can help secure them. And then if you go on to the next one, there's just a bit more pictures of some things that might be necessary to do, like decontamination, having triage on vet things. And then you can see that, I just love that picture with that one cleaning, because that's just so what we do. That is just so what we do. And so if you don't want to clean, you better, well, you can. I mean, we have people that don't do much cleaning. They do the different functions, but we do a lot of cleaning. So if you have that skill, you can come on out. So that's just a lot of different pictures. Those are mostly, I think, from Katrina. And if you look on the where they're washing the dog, they're decontaminating the dog. And in actual fact, those are CDART volunteers that were helping out with another group down at Katrina, and they're actually not wearing their own personal protective equipment. So when I see that picture, I go, oh. So part of our training as well is in personal protective equipment. So if you're decontaminating an animal and you don't have a mask, and you don't, like, they're not wearing anything. So it's good that they're decontaminating the animal. It's bad how they're doing it, but it's a teaching piece. So that's the important piece too, is when you're responding and you're in the moment and it's crisis situation, it doesn't mean you can throw everything else out the window. Like, you still need personal safety, documentation, all those important things still are important, and you still have to stay focused on that. Even if it means everything moves a little slower, in the end, it's going to be better for everybody. So that's my point for that picture. So we go on to the next one. So when it comes to response in an emergency, you never know how long it's going to be. And what we found with CDART is quite often with animals, it's longer for the animals than it is for the people. The reason being is how long I can go stay with my friends. Can I bring all my animals and stay with my friends? Maybe not. I can find temporary lodging. I can find a temporary rental unit, but guess what? It's no pets. You know, I'm going to go live with my dad while they rebuild my house, but my dad already has his pets, and my pets and his pets don't get along. So when we're looking at a response on behalf of animals, and we're looking at how long we may need to help people with their animals, it may be out longer. Now, this is a decision that has to be made. A lot of government authorities say, no, we do 72 hours, or we do whatever we do for humans, that's what we do for animals. So from an emergency management point of view, that decision has to be made. How are we going to work that? Is it going to be the same as humans? Or are we going to go on? CDART being a private charity, we may choose, and we usually do, choose to help people beyond the government support if it's necessary, and knowing that we no longer are part of the government response, but we will quite often still provide assistance with sheltering and fostering and that type of thing. So on the ongoing response, we still have the same issues. We still have resource management, so that's donations and information. As it goes on and on and on, rumors start taking hold, and sometimes what will happen is donations will trickle off. So then you're actually running out of food. But other times it just keeps coming and coming and coming. I mean, this past wildfire season, we had food coming in from everywhere, from other provinces. I think there was even a shipment that came up from Washington State. I mean, people were just like, oh, we got to feed the animals. And the animals were like, oh, I'm really full. So again, it could be either. You have to continue as it goes on, the documentation. You have to continue to control that information and not control the information, but monitor the information and make sure that only good information is going out. And then as it goes on, more and more it becomes important to look at worker care. Like, how long have the people been responding? Because quite often, like, animal people will go to the drop, just like dogs will go to the drop. So will animal people. And they will go, no, I'm fine. No, you're not fine. So the focus needs to go more and more on worker care as it goes, as the response continues. And it becomes a bit of a juggling act, because there may be only insufficient human resources to give everybody necessarily the respite that you really would ideally want. So you have to monitor and manage that situation, because the one thing you don't want people to do is to become broken from the response. And it could be for worker care, it could be that some people, it could be just a length of time. You know, they're exhausted. They've been here for 3 weeks. They're exhausted. They need to go. It could be that someone, for whatever reason, had a trigger. In the first day, they had a trigger, and they've had a trauma, and they need to go home now because of that trigger. But in our focus on animals, it's important that we don't miss each other and take care of each other. And part of what CDART does in our training is we everything is twos. Every time you deal with an animal, you're buddied up. You always have a buddy, and the buddies keep an eye on each other, right? Buddies keep an eye on each other. And if you think someone needs a break, try and get them to take a break. If you can't get them to take a break, go to your supervisor and say, I think so-and-so needs a break. Chances are, if you're buddying with someone and they need a break, you probably need a break too. You won't recognize it in yourself, so we'll probably send you off together. But it's that recognition of that need, of that care. And throughout the emergency management world and the first responders world, there's a lot of emphasis on it now from a recognition. The actual practice and application, we're still a little short on. And I say we, and I mean like firefighters, yeah, we know we need to do it, but still I think we lack that action, and we're no better or worse than anybody else. But it's something that needs to really, in the first 2-3 days, yeah, you're thinking about it, but you're so busy, and it's only 2 or 3 days, and unless something really traumatic happens, probably we can all come through it okay. But as time goes on and on and on in a long response or multiple responses, you've got to start watching your people and make sure that they're going to make it through to the other side okay, or as okay as they can. And then the other big piece of it becomes part of ongoing, and it kind of almost segues, and we will segue shortly into recovery, but is mortality. And in a disaster, animals can die. Anybody can die. And the piece that we have as animal responders is we want to make sure that people don't go home to find their animals dead, or they don't have to see their animals maybe they were burnt, or they've been bloated because they've been out in the sun, or whatever. We don't want the people to have to go through that and have that emotional trauma. So what we will do is we will recover bodies, and we will take pictures of them. We will try and take the best picture possible, so that if the person wants to see a picture, they see their animal sort of basically how they remember their animal, not how their animal is. Quite often people don't necessarily want that. They just want to know that you've recovered them, and that yes, they did pass away. And the other thing they want to know is whether their animal suffered. So normally when we're doing the recovery work, because part of our mortality team is we do offer emotional support to the owners. And I just say to people, I said, don't you ever say that their animal suffered. Like, don't ever say that. Figure out a way. either bald-faced lie because it's for the greater good, or just have a way of saying, no, this is the way. So for instance, Fort McMurray, people in Fort McMurray, it was very difficult because, well, hang on, we should probably wait till hang on. So mortality, we're going to go on to recovery now. So now we're looking at some pictures of just sort of what it might look like inside a shelter, and what people might be doing inside the shelter. And it's important to know that when we have a shelter, it's actually a secure area. So we don't just have people wandering in and out, and it's not an area where people can just come and, well, I don't have anything to do, can I come and see the animals? No, that's not what it is. And normally we have it pretty much on lockdown. And then what can be, you can either have a pet friendly, or you can either have the owners involved with care or not. And depending on what your situation is, where you've set up your shelter, what the security situation is, that's a decision that has to be made as you go. There's pros and cons for both. If the owners help, sometimes it's pretty much always better for them, but not always, because sometimes they're really traumatized by seeing their animals in the temporary shelter milieu, and it's not really good for them. Sometimes it's not good for the animals either. They get agitated when they see their owners, and then it takes us a while to calm them down. So even if you have an open area, like an open shelter where the owners are allowed to help, it may be that you may have to make a decision that this is really not good for you, or it's not good for your animal, and that type of thing. But just to let them know that our shelters are keeping your animals safe as we possibly can, and as comfortable as we can in the circumstances. But they're not ideal. It's a temporary shelter, and you're going to get them back home in one piece. So that when they come in and they see, oh, my dog's he's in a cage, he looks so sad, can't you just let him out because he'll just run around in here? No, we can't do that type of thing, right? So just have the people have an understanding of that. That's always a good thing. So these are just various sort of responses that we've had and different look-sees. So now we go on to recovery. So recovery from an animal situation can be, especially if you have a lot of strays or a lot of animals brought in without documentation because people have gotten excited and rescued a bunch of animals or something. So the two primary difficulties are interlinked, like finding the owner and proving that it's the owner. Because so many people don't have permanent identification on their animals, and so they have no way of proving, yeah, that's my animal. And people say to me, well, if it's someone's dog and they come and the dog will know and the dog will be excited to see them. And I said, well, two things are wrong with that. Number one, because of the disaster and the emergency and the stress, the dog may not react and be glad to see them. And many dogs are just glad to see anybody. So you can't, that's not a proof. Yeah. It's not a proof that you go up and say, hey, Spot, and the dog comes running up because they're excited to get out of the cage and see somebody. It doesn't mean it's their name. It isn't. So from that aspect, it's difficult. So part of when we do our community work and our preparation, we tell people, take pictures of you and your dog, cat, guinea pig, rabbit, fish, whatever. Like, have that with you. Have it in hard copy. Have it on the phone. Like, what if they're lost? So many people now have everything on their phone. Well, you can't stick your phone up on the telephone pole, and you may not be able to access a ginkgo's or something, right? So how do you make a poster? So have some hard copy pictures of your animals so that we can locate them that way. But that was a real difficulty, locating owners and proving ownership. Especially if it's and even with pictures, it can be problematic because I said earlier, what if it's a black lab? What if it's a Rottweiler? I mean, they look very much the same. You can't necessarily prove that's my Rottweiler because here's a picture. Well, that could be that Rottweiler or that one or that one or that one, type of thing. So that's very difficult. The other thing that's difficult around recovery for animal owners is they may need support and resources for proper ongoing care. And this is where I came back to we may have to support them for longer. If their outbuildings, if they have agricultural animals and their outbuildings are burnt or their fences are down, they can't take their animals home, not until they rectify that situation. If it's a pet, if it's an indoor household pet, they may not have a house. They may not be able to access pet-friendly temporary lodging. What does that look like? You know, how do we provide that? And then and that is, you can usually reach out to the community for that. And you should talk to your emergency management people and see how much support or where they're going to, you know, cut off the official support for animals. But, you know, as animal responders, I think you have to be aware of that. And it may be in your situation that you say, you know what, we're only going to support as long as the government support is there. And then we're going to have to tell people that we can't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's great. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But then no matter what, you always have to think to yourself, what do I do? What do we do if someone doesn't come back for their animal?
Yeah.
Because even if people love their animals, sometimes they think that they're better off without them. And sometimes they're just so overwhelmed with the situation that they just think, I can't deal with it, and they'll just disappear. So you need to have something in place if that happens. And it happens very, very rarely, but you need to have something in place if that happens. Or it may be that someone says, you know I have to come and get my animal today, but I can't. And so I would like to have it, but I can't get it today, so I guess you'll just have to give it away or whatever. So those kinds of situations, right? You just need to have a plan for that, what that plan looks like. The suggestion would be that you work with Humane Society, SPCA, Rescue, somebody that can rehome the animal. You know, don't humanely euthanize the animal just because nobody wants it, or their owner doesn't want it at the time, type of thing. So, but as I say, it's rare. Quite often people in the moment will say it, but then they'll rethink it. So, you know, people will say, well, I don't know if I'll come back. I don't know what I'm going to do. But by the time the event has run its course and they've got their new plan, they've come up with a plan. So if someone comes in and says, here's my dog, I'm not coming back for it, no, don't rehome at that point, rehome at the end, after people have time to go through the stress of the moment and realize, oh, that was a bad decision. I had a situation where it was an apartment fire, and the young woman had 2 cats, one of which was a real sketchy, real scaredy cat, and she felt, when she reported her cats missing in the apartment, she felt that the scaredy cat would be better off somewhere else because she'd never want to live with her again because it was too frightening in her apartment. And I said, well, I don't think so. You know, you still are the only thing that cat knows. And she goes, no, it's going to be better for her. And I said, oh, okay. And then when she got to go back to her apartment, she said, oh, can I still have my cat? My other cat? And I said, yes, you certainly can, because she'd gone through her process and now she wanted her cat back. So be very circumspect and about that. After Katrina, they gave most rescues that were down there pretty much gave till November for people to get their animals back. If you remember, Katrina was at the end of August. Most people didn't have their FEMA trailers even by then. Most people didn't know how to find their animals. And so a lot of them were rehomed. And then people later found their animals and wanted them. And there was a lot of problems around that. From a point of view as a CDART founder and volunteer, my opinion is if an evacuee at any point decided they wanted their animal back and they could prove that it was their animal, I would probably give it back to them. For me, yeah. That's a personal thing. That's not a necessarily a CDART thing, but it's pretty much the way we roll. And unless somebody actually signs it over to us, and then we will rehome. We try as much as possible to reunite at the recovery stage. And then the other piece of recovery that I started getting into, and I said, no, let's go over to recovery, is the emotional support if their animals are missing or deceased. And it's almost easier if they're deceased, because we can say, yes, we recovered the body. Yes, they have passed away. They have gone across the Rainbow Bridge. That's what we say. The Rainbow Bridge is where our animals go to wait for us until we get there. If they're missing, like in Fort McMurray, houses were gone. There was nothing. There was nothing to recover. Anecdotally, we had heard that people were kicking in doors if they heard dogs barking. And if your dog is barking and they kick in your door and they rescue your dog, they probably didn't see your cat, but your cat probably ran out later. So where is your cat? We don't know. Is your cat deceased? Is your dog deceased? We don't know. So that was a very difficult situation for people. So, and there was many different Facebook sites where animals were being listed as well. And there was official sheltering and there was unofficial sheltering. It was like our own Katrina almost in a way. And so we would, just advise people, your house is gone. We did not find any remains. We don't know if your animals are deceased. This is where you need to look in case they are not. If it's a cat, it may come back 6 months from now, 12 months from now, whatever. If they are deceased, if they perished in your home, then they would have succumbed to smoke inhalation or lack of oxygen before any fire got them. That was our standard because, again, they didn't suffer. Smoke inhalation, it's not that bad of a way to go, really. Because I find when I deal with people with fires and I will recover their pets, their question is, was it burnt? Were their bodies burnt? And the question is not the question is were their bodies burnt, but the question is really, did they get burned alive? That is the concern. So my concern is to let them know they did not get burned alive. That did not happen. It was fine. So, but that is a very difficult piece when you're doing the recovery. Is if it's an unknown. I really think that's the worst because then people can't have the closure. And as I said, we do take pictures and offer that to people, but mostly they don't need to. They just need to know that we identify it. Like, I'll do that. I'll say, yeah, it was a gray cat and the little white spot right under the left ear. And I explain, because I look, right? And I explain it. And then they go, oh yeah, that's them. So then they know that there's been a positive ID and that, and then they deal with their grief on that, and we can help with them with that. So then the next slide after that is just some of the recovery piece. So there's a reunification, couple of pieces there. The one with the cat, that is a Katrina one. That's me with the cat. If we have time, okay. So that's the young guy came in and came up. They brought him to me because I was dealing with the cats at that point, and this guy said that we have his cat. And so what we do when we remove animals from a home, we will put a sign up saying, we removed animals from this home, and here's how you contact us in case the person's not there, because somebody else may give us permission, or in the case, this was Katrina. In the case of Katrina, people were just going and rescuing animals right and left. Like, as I said, it was very disorganized and no real plan was there. So, but they were putting signs up saying, we took your animal, it's safe, here's where you get a hold of it. And meanwhile, in this particular temporary shelter, we had been moving animals out because they were going into a shutdown mode. So he came up and he says, you guys said you had my cat. And I thought, geez, we probably sent his cat up to Washington State or something. Who knows where it is? So I said to him, okay, so could you describe your cat to me? He says, his name's Dude. So I waited for a moment for further description, and I didn't get any. And I said, well, could you tell me what he looks like? Because he didn't tell me his name. And he said, oh, he's a big old yaller cat, and he's got a big old dew claw on his leg. And I thought, oh my God, we still have that cat. He's just over here, and I'm so glad you're here. He's been getting really depressed because in a temporary sheltering situation, the animals by and large are pretty good at adjusting. But if it goes on and on and on and on, a lot of animals will start shutting down. So the longer the disaster, the more you have to worry about veterinary issues surrounding the animals in your care. The cats, by this time it was October, the cats were pretty much done with the whole temporary thing. So I was very glad to see him. The cat had been just lying around quite depressed. As soon as the guy walked in, he walked up, and I swear to God, the guy goes, Dude, and the cat goes right back at him, Dude, where have you been? Like, the cat, as soon as he saw his owner, he was so ecstatic. And many people felt that people that had left their animals behind did not deserve to get them back because they'd abandoned them. But, you know, this guy and this cat, he'd had the cat since he was a baby and everything. You cannot make a judgment call on someone else's decision.
For sure.
And people will say, oh, well, I would die with my animals. I would never leave. I would die with my animals. And maybe you would, and maybe you wouldn't. I do this. This is my avocation, animals. I've been doing this disaster since 99. I've been doing animal welfare work formally since 94. I would not stay and die with my animals.
Yeah.
I would say, let's go. It's everyone for themselves. Let's see if we can't live. I would not stay and die with my animals. If somebody wants to, that's their choice, and they choose to do that, that's fine. But if someone chooses not to, it doesn't mean they're not a good pet owner and they don't deserve their animals back. Yeah. So part of the recovery piece is not letting your judgment cloud your ability to get the animals back. So we'll go on to the next one. Okay, so now we're looking at the fostering piece, and I did mention the fact that this is quite often something that we need with animals. It's really important to do your due diligence on the foster homes. CDART favors using temporary shelters with trained volunteers over using fostering, purely because we're trained. It's a controlled environment. We know exactly where the animals are and what they're doing at every single time. However, sometimes there's animals that don't do well in that environment, or as I said, when it's all being wound up, we still may have animals that the owners still want them, but they're just not ready for them yet. So we'll use foster homes. It's really important to make sure that the foster home understands it's not their animal. They're not going to get to keep it. They can't necessarily treat that animal like their own animal. For example, you may go out and walk your dog and not have it on a leash. Okay, I may not agree with that, you doing that, but it's your animal. You can make that decision. That doesn't mean you can take the foster animal out and let it off the leash. Even if you're in a park, if you're in an enclosed area, yes, maybe, but maybe not even that, depending. Like we put a lot of rules around foster animals because, again, it's temporary. You're supposed to be keeping them safe as we can until they can go back to their owners. We don't want to go to an owner and say, oh, the foster home lost your animal. Yeah. Right? So it's very important when you're doing your foster homes to make sure that they understand that and go through step by step how they have to keep the animal safe. And it depending on the kind of animal, the requirements are different. And then, hope like mad that it doesn't get lost. And not to say that we couldn't lose the animal as well, but that's what we do. And then are they going to be willing to foster as long as possible? And what does that look at? And do we have a cutoff? Like at some point, if someone keeps saying, well, I'm going to get it, I'm going to get him, well, how far out do you going to get them? So at some point you may have to come up with what is our outside place? And do you have the resources for the fosters? Like, do they need anything? Do they need food? Do they need a crate? Do they need this? And how do you support the fosters? Are you available to them? And then if in the end, for whatever reason, we need to rehome, is it the best decision for the animal? And at that point, you may say, if they've been fostered, you may say to the foster, this animal's going to be rehomed. Do you want to adopt? Now, what we do, we don't adopt CDART. That's not something we do. So we would work with an animal welfare organization to facilitate that, because we're not going to take on the responsibility of the adoption. So whether it would be with an SPCA, a humane society, a private rescue, whatever, because there needs to be support ongoing for the new owner. And it may be that we're fostering it within our CDART system with one of our volunteers, and then we find out, okay, you know what, this animal needs to be rehomed. We just transfer it. Mm-hmm. We transfer it to another charity, another animal welfare charity. When that animal welfare charity then will take the steps to rehome it. And only reputable animal organizations, and you have to do your due diligence on that. There were situations in Katrina that resulted in animals suffering because there was not due diligence done. And so, the one thing we don't want to do is rescue the animals and put them in a bad situation after that. We want them to bring back to the new normal with their owners, or have them continue on and have a good life, whichever works out for that. So the recovery piece is a big piece. And when you go into recovery, we have another form where it actually says you can actually put dates in. So we're going to foster your animal for 3 months. And in that 3 months, you need to keep in touch with us. You need to phone us, email us, text us, whatever, once a week to tell us how you're doing. Are you finding a new place? Are you having problems finding a new place? Do you still want your animal? Whatever. You have to keep in touch with us. And if at the 3 months, and if you don't keep in touch with us, we're going to keep trying to contact you. And if we can't contact you, then you're going to consider to have surrendered your animal. That type of thing. So we've got forms for that too. As I said, it's very, very rare, but we need to be covered, because otherwise, when do you get to rehome the animal if the person disappears? Yeah. Legally, because we're not a government. So governments say, well, we pick up your stray animal, you don't get it within 96 hours, now it's our animal. We don't have that necessarily, right? We haven't heard from you in a week, now it's our animal. Maybe not. Not unless they sign something. So we do have forms for that as well, so that we can make sure that we're not sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, as it were, and trying to figure out, okay, can we rehome this animal? Can we do it yet? Can we do it now? And we have had a couple instances where that happened, and that's why every time something happens, it comes a new form. And as I said, documentation and paperwork is a big part of what we do. So on to the next slide, and it'll just show the guy with the chickens. That would be like a good long-term fostering situation. And all those cages with all those dogs, that was an actual situation in Katrina, where animals were taken up to a sanctuary in Arkansas, and the sanctuary was actually charged with animal cruelty and shut down, and had a ton of New Orleans animals there. And lest people think, oh yeah, that would never happen to me, I actually met the woman. I didn't make the decision, but she actually came to the animal shelter that I was volunteering at Katrina. And I met her, and I talked to her. And I didn't get my spidey senses were not tingling that this was not a good person and not a good placement for animals. So it's not enough just to meet the person and talk to them and know that, oh yeah, I would get a feeling. You need to do your due diligence. And the group that I was with sent their animals up there, but they sent them up there with people that didn't have experience, and they didn't have the authority to make decisions, and they never should have been left there, but they were. So you need to make sure when you're doing things that the right people get sent out and they have the authority to make decisions, and also have them understand, if you get there, so when they got there was supposed to be cages set up for all the animals that they were bringing. The cages were not set up. So right away, that's a red flag. You didn't fulfill step one. So they should have phoned at least. But that's just my opinion. But it wasn't CDART. We would never do that, because we would do all our due diligence and follow our chain of command, and that would all happen. But just to let you know that in reality, bad things can happen to good people trying to do good things. And whether this woman was purposely bad, or whether she had a mental health issue or whatever, I don't know. That it was a really bad situation that we rescued the animals and put them in a bad situation. So on to the final recovery slide. Nope, the almost final recovery slide. And again, I've given it a full slide for worker care, because as I said earlier, you need to make sure that you stay healthy, and that's all part of safety. So it's really important to do daily debriefings, even when you're in the middle of it and you don't actually end your day, because you actually go for longer than 24 hours. But you try and do your day. If anybody's leaving, someone needs to debrief them. They need to be debriefed. They have to. They can't go home without a debriefing. When you're finally done and you're going home, whether it's you're done with your shift and you're not going to come back, or whether we're done completely with a response and we're not coming back, there has to be a demobilization briefing before everybody goes. There has to be. Let people get everything out. Let them, get a little bit of centering back before they go back. And then afterwards, there may be more debriefings, like as time goes on, but you have to make sure that people know that there's ongoing support and resources for them, and you have to be able to provide them that information. A lot of people will not say that they need help. So you can't say, well, if you need help, contact me.
Yeah.
You need to give them that information. If you need help, here's who you contact. You don't contact me, because they may not contact me because they don't want to say that they need help. So you need to get that direct contact information to them. And they need to know that it's okay to need help, and everybody reacts to different ways. And part of that, part of like during our training and then ongoing during our response when we're having our briefings and debriefings, is to remind people, not everybody reacts the same way. Not everybody reacts to stress the same way. We could all be in the same state of stress, but we'll all be showing different symptoms of it. So, recognize it in yourself, recognize it in your buddy, tell somebody if necessary, get somebody some help, because we don't need people falling down on the job, going back to their families and their homes and their lives and not being able to pick up the pieces because they've gone to pieces with us and we haven't supported them adequately. So that's the worker care. And the other piece of recovery is providing that to the pet owners and the animal owners. But keeping in mind when you're doing that is you're not necessarily going to be their best friend and support for the rest of their lives. You were there for the disaster. And at a certain point, you need to probably back away from people that you've been supporting during the disaster. Not necessarily. You may make a new friend in the disaster. But be very careful that the disaster response doesn't continue forever. Because some people, for whatever reason, they'll want to be your best friend. Mm-hmm. But that might not be the best thing for you. So have that piece where, okay, now I'm done, and have that worker recovery one. Now we're on the final recovery slide. So for the overall recovery, there's always going to be multiple debriefs. It's important that the animal piece is included in the debrief for the event at whatever government levels those may or may not be, because if it's excluded, that's a whole piece of the response that's not being taken into account. And be aware that quite often they'll go, well, now we're going to have an animal debrief. Okay, well, that's great too. Everybody who helped the animals, we're all going to have a debrief. That's fabulous. But what about the overall debrief? How did the animals get into the overall debrief? Well, I'm going to bring it. The one government guy who attended the animal debrief is going to bring the animal stuff. Well, okay, worst case scenario, all right. Best case scenario, can we get representatives from at least one or two of the animal groups to attend that overall debrief and present it ourselves as the boots on the ground? Because quite often they're like, logistically, and I get it, logistically, there's only so many people that they want at the table or the teleconference or whatever, and it gets too big, et cetera, but our piece is a big piece. People are, pretty much over 50% of the people probably have animals. And especially if it's a large response, that's a big piece that needs to be represented at those overall debriefs. So that at the debriefs, obviously, we're going to tell them lessons learnable. And that's something from a gal, Sally, out here in BC. It's lessons learnable, not lessons learned. Because she says it's not lessons learned, because the same lessons learned come up every time because we didn't learn them. So I co-opted that from Sally and said, yeah, it's lessons learnable. What can we do better? What's our best practices for next time? Lessons learnable. What worked? What didn't work? All of that piece has to come out specifically to animals, and it has to be funneled up into the overall piece. What worked? What didn't work? Communication-wise, resource-wise, that type of thing. And then, of course, as we feed that all up, then that all feeds back into our original pillar of mitigation, and away we go again, and through the process and the system again. It's very easy sometimes, I think, for them to overlook us at the end, because emergency response personnel as a whole focus on humans, and the animal piece gets missed. And I don't think they're consciously doing it. I don't think they're purposely saying, no, we don't want the animal people here. I think it doesn't even impact their awareness unless somebody says, whoa, what about them? And it may be our piece to come up and say, well, are you guys having any debriefs? Nobody's contacted us. What's going on with that? oh yeah, I guess she should be there too. So it's not necessarily that they don't want us there, it's that they just don't think of having us there. And so a big piece of animals and disasters is sort of, beating our drum a little bit and saying, don't forget about us, being a squeaky wheel. So that we get included in that piece so that next time it works out better. So that's the end of the recovery. So the future plans, these are just high-level future plans. I mean, really the future plans is to, take over the world of Canada and make it all animal disaster friendly. But so the future plans are to expand the availability of the training. So, I mean, really my goal, and if I can do it before I die, I'd be really happy, is to have trained responders. Okay, I'll mitigate my goal. My real goal is to have trained responders in every community in Canada. But maybe that's a bit much before I die. So at least have trained responders in every province and territory in Canada before I die. That's my personal goal. But CDART's goal is to train, have trained responders, if possible, wherever possible, throughout the country. And even if it's only 1 or 2 in each community, they can use their knowledge and use the people in the community as walk-in volunteers and convergent volunteers and work it that way. But somebody needs to have the basic knowledge of what's needed and how to go forward and how to work within the system. And then also to work on getting increased acceptance by emergency management. So it's getting there. Katrina was a watershed moment, but Katrina was, over 10 years ago now. So it's kind of blurry. So and within Canada, the Calgary floods were big. The Fort Mac fires were big. So everything brings it back forward. But anytime there's an emergency, where's the animals? Even while we were responding here in British Columbia to the wildfires, we were getting phone calls from northern Manitoba, and indeed animals died from starvation because of the fires in northern Manitoba and nobody being able to evacuate the animals out or getting in. So we're not there. It's a process that we're in. And part of it is as emergency managers come up, hopefully as we get out there and we try and do things like this webinar, yay, and other presentations to, universities, colleges, veterinary colleges, those type of places, there'll be more and more awareness, and that will, provide more and more of an emphasis. So emergency managers will go, it'll be automatic. Okay, da-da-da-da-da. Oh, and where were the animals in this? Okay, here we go. And it'll just be an automatic thing. And then ultimately, we might like to set some standards so that regardless of if people take CDART training or other kind of training or train themselves or don't bother with training, what are the standards of proper care for proper disaster response for animals? But that's a really long range goal. It might be for someone younger than me. I don't know, somebody watching this webinar now. So that not necessarily the PETS Act like they have in the States, but something so that it says, okay, when you're responding on behalf of animals, this is the standards that we hold you to, because there are standards of animal care, different standards for veterinarians and for animal shelters and things like that, but they're not set up for disaster. So those standards, we can't meet those standards in a disaster situation quite often. So we can't use those standards. So what are our standards? What are the correct standards for a disaster? So that would be, those are our big 3 ticket items for the future. And then the next slides are just some attributes. So what are you looking for in an animal responder? Because if you're trying to put a team together, if you're an emergency manager that's trying to figure out where do I go with this? I mean, the easiest way I've found over the past almost 20 years now is to find a champion that's going to take it on.
Yeah. Like with everything, I think. With everything, find who's going to take that piece on. So you got to find someone who's going to be that champion. And then for that person and for the other people that you want on the team,
you want these attributes. I mean, some of them are pretty, experienced caring for animals. Well, and a desire to assist in a disaster. Well, I hope so. Otherwise, why? That's pretty obvious. So the good interpersonal skills. A lot of times, people who are heavily into animals and animal rescue and animal welfare are sometimes the people who want to be involved in this. But sometimes their people skills are not as good as they could be or should be. So that's sometimes problematic when you're looking for your people. And not everybody has to have this skill, but you have to have some with the skill. And those people have to deal with people. Because you can't have your disaster response person saying, just, yeah, I've got your dog, bye. They've got to, that type of thing. But they focus in on it. They have to, of course, be able to work on a team. They have to be professional, respectful. They have to maintain confidentiality. Everything we do is confidential. We actually have a box on our forms, on our intake forms for the animals, where we ask the question, is it okay if someone phones in and asks about Goldie, the goldfish, can we tell them that Goldie's here with us? And people might say no, because they might be fleeing abuse. They might be, who knows why. It doesn't matter. We don't care why. If they say no, we say no. Sometimes they'll say, well, why? What do you mean? And we'll say, well, your family or friends, maybe they're trying to get through on the human line and they can't. And they think, well, wait a minute. I wonder if these pet people can tell me if their pets are okay. Because if their pets are okay, they're okay. That type of thing. And oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's all right then, or what have you, right? So sometimes they don't understand the question, but once they understand the question, most people say it's okay. But we do that. You have to be able to work on a team. You have to understand and respect the incident command system. You can't have people running off half-cocked on your team because they love animals. Well, I don't care if I die. I don't care if I die as long as I rescue even one more animal. And no, if you've got somebody like that on your team, they can't be on the team, because that's putting everybody at risk. It's putting other first responders at risk. And more importantly, in the big picture, is it's putting disaster response as a whole for animals at a risk, because part of the reason that it's been such a slow go, and we have had through the years a lot of pushback, is they think we're crazy animal people, and then we'll run into a burning building to rescue a dog. Yeah. Now, truthfully, probably a lot of us would be willing to do that and put our lives at risk to do that. But once we get the training with CDART, we agree we're not going to do that. Yeah. So we don't do that. So, and that's the piece of having the trained volunteers, so that we can say to the other responders, to the governmental authorities, the agencies, yeah, we're trained. We're not going to do any of those things. Mm-hmm. We might want to, but we won't, because we've got the training, we understand the rules, and we're not going to break them. So that's the big piece for training. So next slide is, okay, so on this slide again, we start out with the obvious, able to function in a high stress environment. I hope so, otherwise you're in trouble, because disasters are always stressful. Ability to respond on short notice and work long shifts is required. Now that is a bit fluid. I mean, obviously your ideal person will be able to do that, but as I said before, you need people at each stage. You may have someone that comes out and does the 72 hours, but then has to go back to their life, but someone else needs 72 hours to get ready and then can come out. And the long shifts piece, especially in the initial stage, the initial surge, sometimes we work way beyond what we should be working in, but that's the nature of the beast. And it's good if people can do that, if they don't have any health issues that preclude them from doing that. But at the same time, if you have two people coming in to do 2 6-hour shifts, that's better than one person doing 12. Yeah. But like I said, in the early days, when you're having that initial surge, you may not have that capacity available to you. So everybody just kind of hits the ground running and does what they can. Mm-hmm. In 2003, I think I was 3 days in, and I slept a bit. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't up for 72 hours, but I hadn't slept much, and we were in ranch country, and I'm a vegetarian, so I wasn't getting much for food. Oh, no. And I was really dragging it on the third day, and someone had we'd gotten a donation of mane and tail shampoo, so I thought, oh, I'll have a shower. So I did, and I came out and I felt like brand new again. And then I tried it again 3 days later, and it didn't work. I didn't come out brand new after the next. So keep an eye on making sure you're getting your rests and your breaks and stuff like that. But hopefully, the short notice and like I said, not everybody, but enough people that you can get a team on the ground. And then, of course, previous disaster experience if possible. Now, again, that's, hopefully, it'd be great if nobody ever had any disaster experience, but it's a plus. But again, if someone comes in and they go, oh, I was down in Katrina, or I was over in Fort McMurray, or I was down in High River, and I know everything, that can be a problem as well. Because sometimes people say, well, I've taken the training, or I've been here, or I've done this, so I don't need to listen to you because I've been there, done that. So that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, depending on what their attitudes are surrounding that. But it's good to have, because then you've lived it and you're aware of the potential realities of a disaster. However, at that same time, if you've been to one disaster, it doesn't necessarily translate into the next disaster, because they're always different. And if you went to a flood and it's a fire, or if you went to a bomb threat and this is a flood, it's not necessarily going to translate either. But it's always, experience is always good. And also experience with animal handling, obviously. And on to the next one here, which I think is, we're almost to the end. CDART requires a tetanus vaccination, not because we want people to get bit, but because people might get bit. And also when we're out in the field doing our search and response and evacuating animals out, there's a potential for possible puncture wounds and stuff like that. If someone has a reason not to have a vaccination, then we would work with them and try and figure out what that looks like. Some of us have other vaccines as well, because if you're going to go in a flood situation, you want to have your twin Rips so that you don't get your Hep A and B. So there's other things that you can do. We don't require rabies as CDART. We may have to look at that a bit more as we spread out across country. We started in BC, and in BC, rabies is not a real concern too much. Like, we don't have it in our population of domestic animals really at all. And in the wild animals, it's very rare. And I know in other places like Ontario, there's a lot higher incidence of rabies, so we may have to change our requirements depending on locations and that type of thing. However, at the end of the day, if someone says, I don't want any vaccines, but I still want to be a volunteer, then we would have a waiver for them to say that everything's been explained to them and they have chosen not to, and we're not liable, type of thing. So it's not like if you're not going to get vaccinated, we won't accept you. I talked earlier about there's not really an age for a volunteer necessarily, but most government agencies and governments that we work with, they will have age requirements, so we will have to fulfill them. In BC, in most provinces, 16 is covered. You can start at 16, and then the age of majority changes provincially depending on what province you're in. So from the point of view of the response as a whole, whatever the government legal requirement is becomes CDART's legal requirement, because that way you're covered as a responder. Not that anything's allowed to go bad, but just in case. From the point of view from CDART ourselves, we do not send out any volunteer on a search and response, so nobody goes into an evacuated area unless they're the legal age of majority for the province or territory that they're responding in. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that they reside in. So if you reside in BC and you're responding in Saskatchewan, it's not your BC age of majority, it's your Saskatchewan, and vice versa. So, and that is, again, it's sort of more of a liability coverage type of situation. And then also, if you're not legally an adult, I'm not going to ask a parent, and nor do I think a parent should sign off and say, yeah, you can send my 16-year-old child into an evacuated area where they might, encounter floods or fires. That's just not acceptable from the safety point of view that we started with, number one rule. And then ideally we'd want people to be able to commit some time during non-disasters. And that again is because of the mitigation preparedness piece. Sure. And trying to, if we have volunteers that are willing and able to do that. We have a number of volunteers that don't do that. They just said, no, I'm there for the disasters, I'm there for the animals, I don't want to talk to people. And most of them, it's like, yeah, we don't want you talking to them anyways. Because again, as I said, those are those people that are really animal focused. And that's where and we need all kinds of people, and we need those kind of people. But ideally, if you can get a champion that has all these attributes, then, you know, that's a good champion.
Awesome.
When I started being a champion back in 1999, I didn't have any disaster experience because there hadn't been any disasters at that point in time. But it was a matter of, okay, this is a need, and then, you know, where do I research? And it was all in the States. And, you know, as I said, so now we're trying to get it in Canada, so that when people come, it's okay, it's Canada. This is the way the Canadian government works. This is the way the provincial government works. It's not American. We don't have to talk about counties and states. We're actually talking about provinces, and it's easier and better to, I think, get that training and get the buy-in if it's actual national, Canada pride kind of thing. So anyways, that is the end. We go on to the final thing. That is the end of the formal part of my webinar. And you can see I'm bringing along the new animal responder there. He gave me his flag so he could play with our little stuffed dog there. So thank you very much for this opportunity. There's my contact information. I will not, if someone contacts me, I may refer them to someone else depending on what their inquiry is and what they want to know, but I'm a good point of contact. The best thing, if it's a non-emergency, just shoot me an email. I'll normally get back to you within 48 to 72 hours on the emails. If it's an emergency, that's my cell phone number, 24/7. 365, it's always on. Don't worry about what time it is. Just phone me. Like, don't go, I'm in Ontario. What time is it in BC? I am in BC. Because even if it's just helping over the phone, like now you watch the webinar, you know about CDART, something happens, reach out, call, okay, help, I'm trying to help. There's a fire and I'm trying to help. What can I do? Where can I go? We are working on revamping our website, so it's got some resources on there. We're adding to it all the time. We can help out where we can, even if it's a phone call. Mm-hmm. So, but again, we do appreciate the opportunity to do this, and we hope that you guys all remember animals when you're doing your disaster work in the future.
Of course, Cheryl, this has been an extremely interesting presentation. I thank you sincerely for your time. Many times I had questions and then you ended up answering them. So thank you for being so thorough. And we definitely have your email address, and I'm sure people will be writing to you and with some of their questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.